The year was 1967, and the sun hung low over the naval base in Long Beach, California. Bruce Lee had been invited to attend a special ceremony honoring the brave men and women who served in the United States Navy. It was a prestigious event, filled with high-ranking officers, decorated veterans, and their families. Bruce Lee, though not yet the international superstar he would become, was already making waves in the martial arts community. His demonstrations of Jeet Kune Do, his revolutionary fighting philosophy, had captured the imagination of many, and his reputation as a formidable martial artist was spreading rapidly throughout Southern California. As he arrived at the naval base, dressed in his signature black training uniform with the crisp lines and minimal adornments that reflected his philosophy of stripping away the unnecessary, Bruce carried himself with a quiet confidence that immediately drew attention. The naval officers and their guests couldn't help but notice this compact, muscular figure moving with the grace of a panther through the crowds of military personnel in their dress whites and blues. The ceremony itself was a formal affair, complete with color guards, speeches from admirals and commanders, and the presentation of various commendations and medals. Bruce Lee had been asked to give a brief martial arts demonstration as part of the day's entertainment, something to showcase the discipline and dedication that paralleled the military's own values. He had agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to share his art and philosophy with a new audience. But as the formal proceedings drew to a close and the crowd began to mingle during the reception, Bruce found himself the subject of considerable curiosity and, from some quarters, skepticism. Many of the naval officers, trained in hand-to-hand combat as part of their military instruction, viewed martial arts through a lens of practical military application. To them, the flowing movements and philosophical underpinnings of traditional martial arts seemed almost theatrical, divorced from the brutal realities of actual combat they had been trained for. Bruce could sense the mixture of curiosity and doubt in the air. He had encountered this attitude before, particularly from those who practiced more conventional fighting systems or who had military combat training. They saw his smaller stature compared to many of the burly sailors and officers around him, and they questioned whether his art could truly be effective against a larger, stronger opponent. Among the crowd was a particular naval officer, a lieutenant commander named Robert Harris, who had made quite a name for himself as the base's boxing champion. Harris was an imposing figure, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders and arms that had been sculpted through years of military physical training and competitive boxing. He had won numerous tournaments and had never been defeated in any sanctioned match on the base. As the reception continued, Harris found himself in a group of fellow officers discussing Bruce Lee's upcoming demonstration. One of his colleagues mentioned that Bruce claimed his Jeet Kune Do could defeat any style of fighting, including boxing. This statement immediately piqued Harris's interest, and a slight smile crossed his face. He had heard such claims before from various martial artists, and he had always viewed them with deep skepticism. In his experience, when the gloves came on and fists started flying, all the fancy kicks and forms went out the window, and it came down to who could hit harder and take a punch. Harris excused himself from the conversation and began making his way toward where Bruce Lee stood, surrounded by a small group of admirers asking questions about his training methods and philosophy. As he approached, the crowd seemed to part naturally, perhaps sensing the tension that was building. Harris positioned himself directly in front of Bruce, his considerable height advantage allowing him to look down at the martial artist. Lieutenant Commander Harris extended his hand, and Bruce shook it firmly, noting the strength in the officer's grip and the calluses that spoke of years of heavy bag work and sparring. "Mr. Lee," Harris began, his voice carrying a tone that was polite on the surface but edged with challenge. "I've heard quite a bit about your martial arts abilities. Very impressive credentials, I'm sure." He paused, allowing his eyes to sweep over Bruce's frame in a way that was clearly assessing, measuring. "But I have to be honest with you. I've been boxing for 15 years. I've trained with some of the best fighters in the Navy, and I've sparred with men who claimed to be masters of karate, judo, and all sorts of exotic fighting systems. None of them could last more than a minute against real boxing." The conversation around them had begun to quiet, and more people were turning their attention to this exchange. Bruce remained calm, his expression neutral, but his eyes intensely focused on the officer before him. He had been in this exact situation countless times before, the challenge, spoken or unspoken, from someone who believed their size, strength, or conventional fighting experience made them superior. "I appreciate your experience, Commander," Bruce replied evenly, his accent still noticeable but his English clear and precise. "Boxing is a noble art with a rich tradition. I have great respect for skilled boxers." Harris's smile widened slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's very diplomatic of you, Mr. Lee. But here's what I'm thinking. You're about to give a demonstration of your... what do you call it? Jeet Kune Do? To all these people. And they're going to watch you hit some pads, maybe break a board or two, do some of those flying kicks I've heard about." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only those immediately around them could hear. But that's not real fighting, is it? That's just performance. What these sailors and officers really need to see is how your style holds up against a real martial artist, against someone who's actually been in the ring, taken real hits, and delivered real knockouts. The challenge was now explicit, and the circle of onlookers had grown considerably. Several officers had moved closer, and even some of the event organizers were now paying attention to what was unfolding. Bruce took a slow breath, his mind rapidly calculating the situation. He understood the psychology at play here. Harris was protecting his territory, his identity as the base's fighting champion. This public challenge was as much about maintaining his status among his peers as it was about testing Bruce's abilities. In Jeet Kune Do philosophy, Bruce had always emphasized that true martial arts were not about ego or proving superiority, but about self-knowledge and honest self-expression. Yet he also understood that sometimes the only way to truly communicate the effectiveness of his art was through demonstration, not words. "What exactly are you proposing, Commander?" Bruce asked, his tone remaining respectful but clear. Harris gestured broadly. "I'm proposing that instead of shadowboxing and hitting pads, you fight a real martial artist. Me, right now. Just a friendly sparring match, nothing too serious. No gloves if you prefer. I know you martial arts types like to keep it traditional. We can do it right here in the gymnasium. Let these sailors see what real combat looks like when Eastern martial arts meet Western boxing. What do you say, Mr. Lee? Are you willing to fight a real martial artist?" The words, "fight a real martial artist," hung in the air with particular emphasis, the implicit suggestion being that Bruce himself might not qualify for that designation. The crowd was now completely focused on this exchange, and Bruce could feel the weight of expectation settling over the scene. Some faces showed excitement at the prospect of witnessing such a match, while others showed concern, perhaps worried about the diplomatic implications if a civilian guest ended up injuring a naval officer, or vice versa. Bruce Lee stood perfectly still for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, a slight smile crossed his features. "All right, Commander Harris," he said quietly, "if it will help these sailors understand the principles of true martial arts, I accept your challenge. But I suggest we make it brief. 10 seconds should be sufficient." Harris let out a short laugh, which was echoed by several of the officers around him. 10 seconds? "Mr. Lee, I don't think you understand. This isn't some movie fight scene. Real boxing matches last 3-minute rounds. But if you want to try your luck for 10 seconds, I suppose we can start there and see how long you actually last." The group moved toward the base's gymnasium, word spreading quickly through the reception. Within minutes, a sizable crowd had gathered in the training facility. The event organizers, initially alarmed at this unexpected turn, decided to allow it to proceed after confirming that both parties were willing participants and that it would be controlled sparring with no serious intent to injure. The gymnasium was a typical military training space, with wrestling mats, boxing rings, and various equipment along the walls. Harris removed his dress jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing muscular forearms. He began bouncing lightly on his toes, throwing a few practice jabs and crosses into the air, his movements sharp and practiced. The crowd watched him with appreciation, many of them having seen him fight before and knowing his capabilities. Bruce, meanwhile, simply stood at the edge of the mat, barely moving except for subtle shifts in his stance. His breathing was slow and controlled, his eyes never leaving Harris. To the casual observer, he appeared almost relaxed, but those with trained eyes could see the coiled readiness in his posture, like a spring compressed and waiting for release. One of the other officers, a captain who had some boxing experience himself, volunteered to act as a timekeeper and referee. "Gentlemen," he announced, "this will be a 10-second exhibition sparring match. Keep it clean and stop immediately when I call time. Are you both ready?" Harris assumed a classic boxer's stance, hands up, chin tucked, weight balanced, and ready to move. "Ready," he confirmed. Bruce shifted slightly, his stance lower and more fluid than the rigid boxing position, his hands held in a position that seemed almost casual, but was actually perfectly positioned to defend or attack from multiple angles. "Ready," he said softly. "Begin!" the captain shouted, and simultaneously clicked the stopwatch. Harris immediately launched forward with a speed that surprised many in the crowd who had only seen him in formal dress. He threw a quick jab, testing Bruce's defenses, expecting to gauge his opponent's reactions before committing to more powerful strikes. But Bruce Lee wasn't there. In a movement so fast, it seemed almost supernatural to those watching. Bruce had shifted his position, slipping the jab by mere millimeters while simultaneously closing the distance between them. Before Harris could even begin to process what had happened, he felt a light but precise tap on his jaw, then another on his solar plexus, and a third to his ribs, all delivered in what seemed like a single flowing motion. The strikes weren't delivered with full force. Bruce had no intention of actually hurting the officer, but they were executed with such precision and speed that Harris immediately understood he was completely out of his depth. Harris attempted to reset, to use his reach advantage and throw a combination. But again, Bruce seemed to anticipate his movements before they even began. Another series of taps landed on Harris's body, each one placed with surgical precision on vulnerable points that made it clear they could have been devastating strikes if Bruce had chosen to follow through with full power. The officer tried to change tactics, attempted to clinch, to use his size advantage, but found himself dealing with an opponent whose understanding of body mechanics and leverage made size almost irrelevant. Bruce redirected Harris's momentum, swept his leg, and had him off balance before the officer even fully registered what was happening. "Time!" the captain called out, though his voice was barely necessary. The match was clearly over. The entire exchange had lasted exactly 10 seconds, and in that brief span, Bruce Lee had demonstrated complete and total control. He had struck Harris at least a dozen times, had evaded every attack the boxer had attempted, and had done so with such minimal movement and effort that it appeared almost effortless. Harris stood there, breathing heavily more from the shock of the experience than from exertion, his face flushed. Bruce, by contrast, wasn't even breathing hard. The gymnasium had fallen completely silent. The sailors and officers who had been expecting to see their champion easily handle this smaller martial artist now stood in stunned amazement. Bruce extended his hand to Harris, who, after a moment's hesitation, shook it. "You are indeed a skilled boxer, Commander," Bruce said respectfully. "Your technique is solid, your speed is good. But boxing, like any art, has its limitations. Jeet Kune Do is about adapting, about using whatever works in any given moment, about being like water, formless, shapeless, able to fit into any container. When you limited yourself to one style, one approach, you became predictable, and in real combat, predictability is fatal." Harris nodded slowly, the initial flush of embarrassment beginning to fade as the lesson sank in. "I understand now," he said, his voice quieter than before but sincere. "I apologize for my earlier arrogance, Mr. Lee. That was truly remarkable." The crowd erupted in applause, not in mockery of Harris, but in appreciation of what they had just witnessed. Bruce Lee had not just defeated a larger, stronger opponent. He had done so with such control and precision that he had turned what could have been a humiliating experience into a teaching moment. He had demonstrated not just the physical effectiveness of his art, but the philosophical principles that underpinned it: efficiency, directness, and simplicity. In the years that followed, the story of Bruce Lee's 10-second victory at the naval base would become one of many legends surrounding the martial arts icon, told and retold among sailors and martial artists alike, a testament to the power of dedication, innovation, and the willingness to challenge conventional thinking in pursuit of truth.